Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I'm very, very good, and I'm excited today. We get to have one of my friends on the pod today, and it's nice it's nice meeting people that I don't know yet. That's sort of the best part about podcasting, I think, is that you get to meet all these cool people that you've been wanting to talk to, and now you have a reason to sort of poke them and tell them to show up and ask them questions. But it's also cool to have your friends on the pod, and that's what we get to do today. So that's exciting for me too.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Liam Farquhar. Liam is interesting. He's an ex Big Four management consultant who now works as a London-based legal psychedelics guide. He's an experienced meditator and is going to talk to us a little bit about the relationship between psychedelics and meditation and other related bits and pieces. Liam, how are you, mate?
Good. Yes, thank you for that. Very much looking forward to this chat.
Um, so let's jump in. Psychedelics are one of those areas in meditation where they've been in the ecosystem for ages. My first bumping into the idea of them was reading about Ram Dass in the 60s. What's the state of play today when it comes to psychedelics and meditation?
And meditation. Um, I mean, to be honest, I'm not too sure on like the latest research on psychedelics and meditation. I just know that there have been similarities named for decades. I think especially when it comes to the classic psychedelics, what are called the tryptamine psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, the ones that work more on the serotonin system and their effect on the default mode network. They seem to do, somewhat similar things to, like down regulating activity within the default mode network. That still seems to be the case. I'm actually drifting away from the classic tryptamine psychedelics. I'm focusing more on MDMA and trauma. I think those especially with my kind of therapeutic training in somatic experiencing and internal family systems. We could talk about that at one point, actually, like the kind of similarities between internal family systems and mindfulness. That could be interesting. Um, but yeah, my understanding is that tryptamine, classic psychedelics, and meditation still do very similar things to the brain. Ram Dass famously gave his teacher a very, very high dose of LSD, and it reportedly did nothing to him because he was
Yeah,
like
you
in
hear
that.
this a few times. There's a few stories like this floating around where high-level yogis get given psychedelics and it just doesn't do anything. Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know how
I'd like to
true this
get, I'd
story
like to,
is.
I'd like to get
I,
one
I,
of
I've
these yogis in a scanner. Really, I'd like to get one of these yogis in a scanner and see what's actually happening. I mean, it's very weird thing that maybe it does nothing on a well-trained mind. I'd like to hear a little bit since you brought it up. I mean, you're working with MDMA and trauma. It's a fascinating thing. How's that?
so MDMA works very differently um, to the classic tryptamine. So some people call it a psychedelic, others don't. Same with ketamine. Some people say that's a psychedelic, others don't. Others would just say psychedelics are the classic tryptamine psychedelics. I consider it a psychedelic. So I mean, what it does, it increases oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. Probably most importantly, it decreases activity in the two parts of the brain associated with fear, the insula, the amygdala. So it creates this cushioning, this safety to go into stuff that, our protective parts are usually very effective at making sure that we never access those deeper parts of us, those hurt parts, those parts of us that were abandoned, abused, neglected, shamed, overwhelmed. Those protective parts, they're soldiers and they make sure that we just don't go anywhere near that. So, MDMA can help bring more access to self energy, big S self. Um, I've been, the phrase that I've been using recently is, the heart is the gateway to the self. And what I mean by that is that the ventral vagal parasympathetic nervous system, when we're in that state, we're in a state of self. or we have more access to it. We're in a state of curiosity, of courage, of connection. So those protective parts kind of soften a bit, which gives more access to self, which is always there, of course. And there's, like Dick Schwartz, the creator of IFS, he says that nothing can overwhelm the self. It's infinite. It's unoverwhelmable. So he kind of butts heads with Peter Levine, who is the creator of somatic experiencing, which is very trauma informed. So we're taught to do everything very slowly in somatic experiencing. We have resources, and we pendulate in and out, and we titrate, and we do bit by bit, slowly. And I think both are true. I think if you are in self, it is unoverwhelmable. You can't overwhelm it, which MDMA helps access to, which is why it's such a powerful therapeutic tool, I believe. But it's just hard to access self, right? And that's where the tools and the resources come in. So I think you need both.
Just to jump back, what is self in this context?
Nice.
Good question. So the way that I define self is this, like other way you could, I call IFS an iPhone of therapeutic models, that it's got some of its own innovations, but essentially it's brought together existing innovations and packaged it up in this model that just works. So it's brought together innovations from Gestalt, from Jungian therapy, from humanistic therapy, from family systems, but also like shamanic and spiritual models as well. So like other ways to define the self could be Atman, it could be Buddha nature, it could be Christ consciousness. These are old ideas. I define self as this infinite space that is formless, timeless, has no agenda, no judgment, and has infinite amounts of curiosity, and it can just hold all of our parts without judgment, without agenda. As soon as there's a judgment or an agenda, which could be like a self-like part, those are like the therapist parts, those are the parts that want to fix, then it's not self, it's self-like, and that's the distinction. But the self just has infinite space to hold. That's how I see it.
Right. So you're helping people discover a part of themselves that's broad and more spacious and more enduring, and is able to hold different parts of themselves that ordinarily don't get seen. And to do that, they've got to have a sort of deep sense of safety, because if the bits are too powerful and too loud, then it's difficult to know that you're safe.
Yeah.
And MDMA is one tool in your toolkit to help people feel more essentially safe, so that they're safe to sort of explore and digest the thing that they're waiting to go through, something like this.
Yeah, exactly. And there's other tools as well, like old technology, singing, humming, in somatic experiencing, we make a voo sound. It's just a way of like bringing some, I call it like massaging the nervous system from the inside out. And movement, like mobilizing that energy. But so MDMA is great for the courage to explore places, but it's also really good for trauma release. And we can get into that. But, like really, I think we're discovering more and more what trauma actually is, the limitations of the DSM's definition. I'm very critical of that definition, and I've written a big essay called Trauma Needs A Rebrand that goes into some of those criticisms about the DSM and about like mental health approaches just generally, including the extension to the psychedelic protocols that are now coming into play. They're very neck up approaches, not very trauma informed, and I think we need to, the reality is we're an organism. Right, we know this. I'm speaking to the converted. I'm sure, like we're an organism of interconnected, interdependent systems. They're all working together. The brain, the mind, is obviously one part of that, but it's not the entirety of it. And we have this deep inner wisdom, and it's all of these systems collaborating. And in fact, the brain is less of a CEO, and it's more of like a meeting room where all of these systems need to come together to have a place to decide and agree on what's the next best thing to do. And often the mind, and this is like classic psychotherapy, it can get in the way. Those protective parts that are named earlier, they can have very convincing stories, and their kind of motto is to do and say whatever it takes. And when I reflect back on my own kind of conventional psychotherapy for years, I got caught up in their stories and they sounded convincing, and it kind of felt true, but like the outcome was that I didn't get better, in the sense that my unwanted symptoms, chronic insomnia, difficulties with intimacy, having, being in a relationship, all these things remained. I understood some things better to a point, but I make the point in the essay that there's a huge difference between understanding and healing, that we need to rewrite our life scripts, we need to tell ourselves better stories, but if that's all we're doing, it's limiting. And in fact, healing, I believe, is primarily a physiological process. It's releasing, it's discharging that trapped energy that we all have on a continuum that gets generated in response to overwhelm and adversity. And that could be a boundary crossed from our history, but from our environments. We live in stressful environments. We're like, it's this post-Protestant work ethic where we're conditioned to just push all the time. So like, we're getting overwhelmed all the time, and that has, that energy, the survival energy, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol gets generated in response to that. It gets stuck in our bodies. And in fact, the rational mind can get in the way of that automatic discharge that we've evolved as mammals to know how to instinctively to do. We just have forgotten how to do it. So a big part of my work is helping people remind their bodies that they can release trauma physically. And that has a knock-on impact on the stories, because if we don't feel safe, and often we don't realize that, if we're not feeling safe, then our stories are going to be affected about ourselves, others, and the world.
So there's quite a lot in there to pick apart. But just while I've got it, what, in your perception, are the drawbacks of using MDMA or psychedelics as part of a trauma release?
I guess there's two questions there. Like, what's the drawbacks of psychedelics? Like say, let's compare psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, and MDMA. Is that helpful? Would that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good.
There's that piece, but I also just want to know about the high level drawbacks of using either of.
Yeah, well, they're both different. Like the benefits and drawbacks are different for both.
That's it.
So, I mean, the drawbacks for, say, like a classic tryptamine psychedelic is that, so the modern protocols, right? They're created by neuroscientists, they're created by psychiatrists, they're created by traditional conventional psychotherapists. They are neck up approaches. Some of the original language around them have kind of stuck, and I know the people now who said these things, who did TEDx talks, and lovely people, and they were lost in the sauce. They were excited. They were early in their careers. This was a different model. They were excited. Fair, I would be too. And then they were on a stage talking about it, but they were using language like, one psilocybin journey is like 10 years of therapy in a day. They're using language like it resets the brain. So people come to me with that kind of, and it's this extension of this biomedical model that is like, oh, there's something just wrong with the brain. I just need to take this drug and it fixes it. And that's not how it works. That's not how any therapeutic model works. It takes time. So this protocol that I developed is 3 months minimum, because it takes time to build trust with parts that maybe we haven't spoken to or been ignored for a long time. It takes time to reconnect to the body safely and slowly, to remind the body, or to remind that we are a body. We don't just have this body. The body isn't just this thing that takes our brain from meeting to meeting. So these tools and resources take time to embed and practice, and then they can be used after the process. And that's kind of the point. So the kind of classic model, which I've become somewhat critical of, is like, have a little bit of prep, have a big high dose experience. All of the positive clinical outcomes are dependent on someone having a mystical experience, which is, one, really hard to define, and two, not everyone has one, which can lead to disappointment, and three, even if you have one, it's great. It's like, Bill Richards, he's one of the early researchers. He's up there with like Stanislav Grof, one of the kind of legends of this space. He kind of he considers the mystical experience like having a helicopter ride to the top of the spiritual mountain, so you see what you're working towards, and you kind of see the point in a way. But then you go back down to where you were in your journey. You're not enlightened. You still need to make that walk. You still need to learn all the lessons the hard way. And that's where spiritual bypassing can come in the psychedelic space. It's like, oh, I've got it now, you know. And it, you know, reminds me of Alan Watts' line, you know, once you get the message, hang up the phone. And, you know, I don't think that's necessarily always needed. Like he was saying that in the 60s and the height of the countercultural movement where people were doing psychedelics irresponsibly. I think it's more understandable why he said that then. Yeah, so that model was like a little bit of prep. Fingers crossed you have a high dose experience, you know, a mystical experience. That, you know, that brings the spirituality to your life. Great. And then tiny bit of integration. And that's the kind of like retreat model. It's just a factory churning people in and out.
I don't like any of this. This doesn't smell right to me at all. I don't like it in the meditation scene. I don't like it in the like holotropic breathing scene. I mean, I had a pranayama breathing teacher in India, and he said, he goes, what we're going to be working on is a 3-year program. He goes, in the first year, I want to get you to where you're breathing one breath a minute for 30 minutes. And he goes, that's a year program. You don't do that in 10 days. You don't do it over the weekend. You have to slowly change the way that you're metabolizing oxygen and the body's metabolization of carbon dioxide. And he goes, this is a long-term thing. You can't do this in a weekend. You're supposed to do it slow because it takes a long time for the breath to change. Same thing with the mind. So I hear you. I mean, just even you saying it is giving me I feel all the like wobblies in my body just to be like, okay, well, look, all we're going to do is we're going to set the stage and then we're just going to blast off. And hopefully you get jostled from your garbage enough that you come back and have some like benefits, but who knows? Because maybe it just like rockets you in a completely different direction. Awful idea. So what are you doing different? That's sort of a good way to go from here. Like okay. So I think we agree, even though it was the norm not too long ago, and I still think lots of people are running on these old models. Now that we're starting to think, well, maybe that's not the best way for development to get in to make a real change. What do we do instead? I mean, what do you do as a trauma coach or as a psychedelics coach that's not that? I mean, what's the alternative?
I'll get there, but I mean, the worry is that this clinical model is, you know, because what's happened is that, you know, these early claims were made. Now these people have done 180s on these claims and in fact written open letters apologizing for making these claims because that set the tone. The media loved it. Investment started pouring in, developing protocols that were based on this early research. So, and it's like, you know, who wins the narrative? Usually the narratives are won by people with technology and money. The people with technology and money are coming in from a more biomedical model, clinical model. So my hope is that eventually there'll be a space where you got the McDonald's of the space, like the big companies like MindMeds, like Compass Pathways, that will help legitimize the space. We probably necessarily need a clinical model to like a for-profit clinical model to reschedule these substances because it's extraordinarily expensive. And even someone like MAPS with Rick Doblin at its helm can't raise enough money to do all of the research that's required. So it's kind of like the for-profit models, you know, arguably a necessary evil. But hopefully there'll be the McDonald's of the space and then the farmers markets of the space. And then people will have a choice. What I do differently is offer a longer process because it's not about, people come to me. It's like, oh, I read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, or I read or I watched the BBC documentary or the Netflix show. And yeah, I just want to reset my brain. It's like, okay, so now I've got an automated response. It's just like, this is what this process is. And I make my essay mandatory reading before they get in contact. So before they get in contact with me, they've got a big list of like what this process is. They've read my essay and they've done a thorough health screening before I even consider having a call. The main difference that I do is prioritizing healing as primarily a physiological process. So discharging that stuck energy, and we can discharge that through like shaking, tremoring, teeth chattering. You know, you see like trauma or stress and that continuum as a state of contraction. So like we might grind our teeth for years, we may clench our jaw for years. All of that energy is stuck in the jaw muscles and it can come out. So I have to teach people embodiment. I have to teach people proper breathing. And it's very much, and meditations. I've recorded like bespoke meditations for this course. This is before the first journey. So the protocol is 3 journeys, 9 calls. There's a whole bunch, there's comprehensive written guides that support the process. There's guided meditations. So a bunch of it is embodiment. And it's being present with the breath, with the body in the moment, and then just letting the organism in the journeys do what it's evolved to do over millions of years. Like our organisms know how to instinctively heal as mammals. Our physiological systems are designed very similarly to other mammals. So we do that, and it's just a longer process, right? So it's about building tools and resources throughout this process, prioritizing somatic release in the journeys themselves, but then working with the parts that come up in more of an internal family systems model throughout the process, because stuff can come up, even after a journey. They could be like, oh my God, we're unburdened finally, like we accessed this deep stuff and like it wasn't that scary after all. Or they could be like, oh, actually that was a bit too fast and I didn't really have full permission. So before the first journey, we speak to any parts that have any fears, concerns, doubts, and we really give them an opportunity to hear them out and to work through any of those fears and concerns, and really like honor their hard work as well. Because like even the part that has an inner, the inner critic, even that part is on our side. It's trying to keep us safe. Maybe in the past we put ourselves out there, we made ourselves vulnerable, we got burnt really bad. It doesn't want us to get burnt again. So it will say and do whatever it takes to make sure that we never put ourselves in that situation again. So it could call us a piece of shit. It could say you're worthless. It was to say you always fail, don't try. They can be harsh, but they are on our sides. And, we learn that over this process. So it can be a shortcut to self-compassion. So it's kind of like, building these tools and resources over a longer period. And it just takes longer to build, practice and develop new skills. So the skills, the tools, the resources are breathing tools, mindfulness tools, trauma release tools, embodiment tools, ways to unblend from parts, get curious about parts, ways to connect with self. These are all like lifelong skills that will benefit the process, but then also afterwards as well.
You spoke about something embodied there, like the idea of like shaking out, so to speak. So like, let's say this is an example I've read, I think Ramdas used. If dad hits mum and dad was wearing a grey suit, now you might have a nervous system response to seeing a man in a grey suit, to keep things very simple.
Yeah.
And let's say that nervous system response manifests in you clenching your jaw. How does the embodied action, the controlled clenching of the jaw, etc., help address that initial trauma and the initial perception formed around it?
So is the question like, why do we go into these protective mechanisms in the first place, or like how do we release it?
No,
or
the
why
question
do
is
why?
how does the question is how does the release? You mentioned the jaw shattering.
Yeah, to teach
How does
chattering. Yeah.
because it seems to me that obviously has to address in some ways the initial trauma. And my question to you is, what are the mechanics of how it does address the initial trauma?
Yeah. So I mean, so often, there is no story associated with a somatic release, and almost like how could there be, right? Like we are cylinders of stuck energy, a lifetime's worth of overwhelm, of stress, a lifetime's worth of developing, generating what Peter Levine calls survival energy, fight flight energy that's designed to protect us, to get out, to fight or flee. Often we can't do that when we're young because we don't have any resources, we don't have anywhere to go. So we enter freeze, that's the next, mechanism down, and all the energy gets stuck. And often now the thinking mind gets in the way of releasing that stuck energy. So when that energy comes out, and it comes out mostly when we're breathing into the abdomen, when we feel safe, when we're very present. I've got a neon sign, the Ram Dass quote, in fact, be here now. And my instructions for the day itself is, nothing to manage, nothing to control, nothing to understand. If there's meaning making needed, we could do that afterwards. But today is a gift, a day of breathing and being in the body and just letting your organism do what it needs to do. I invite sound, I invite movement. This isn't a lie down, eye mask on, listen to headphones type of experience. So when the energy release comes out, it's who knows like what exactly it's related to. and almost like, and again, it's impossible to know. Like as you know, every time we remember a memory, it changes the memory. So every time we're going back, we're always adding a layer of abstraction to what actually happened. So it's almost like not that important, or not as important, to know exactly where it came from. It's more important for me in this model to release it, to have a felt sense of safety in the journey, and then work with the parts more like on a narrative base afterwards, especially the protective parts, to make sure that they're aware of what's happened and are they cool with it.
So the
Does that make
emphasis,
sense?
therefore, yeah. So the emphasis, therefore, isn't on quote unquote, in traditional terms, addressing the root cause of the trauma. It's saying, well, that.
Well, it is because it's in the body. The root is in the body. It's in the nervous system. Like how it got there is a combination of things accumulated over a lifetime. But the root, this is what I'm trying to do in my work. Like I'm trying to address the root in parts, and parts live in the body. They control our physiological processes. You know, their mind body. So yeah, what I'm trying to do is address the root at a nervous system level, at a parts level, at a somatic level. Whereas my criticism of some of the psychedelic protocols that exist today is that they don't address the root. They're only working at a narrative level, which is an essential part of the process. But again, it needs to go deeper for me.
Right, so you're saying that the symptomology, so that's the energy getting stuck, etc., that happens because of, say, the example Ramdas used, dad in grey suit hits mum. You're saying, well, if you stay there, you're getting caught up in narrative. But if you want to solve things at quote unquote the root, what you need to do is address the symptomology which lives in the body.
Yes, because like you can tell yourself, like, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, like they're useful tools to know when we're catastrophizing, when we're going black and white, all or nothing thinking. But basically, like a lot of what it does is gaslight our parts. It's just like think better thoughts, and it's like like rationally we could say, of course, people in the grey suit are safe, of course, but we don't feel safe, and it's unconscious. So this is an unconscious process, and it needs to be resolved primarily somatically. And this is like, I guess, like the cutting edge of what a trauma-informed approach is, which is being spearheaded by people like Peter Levine, like Deb Dana, like Pat Ogden, like Stephen Porges, Bessel van der Kolk. But, somatic experiencing, why I chose that training among the other trainings that I did, is that it's the most sophisticated trauma training out there today, defining trauma in a very different way than the DSM does.
Who are the DSM?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. So it's basically what psychiatrists use to diagnose people. We could go into the controversy of that. Don't know if there's time, but there's more and more people speaking out against it, including the ex-leadership of it, because more and more disorders are being added to it with each edition, and the committee, everything's voted on by committee, and those committee members, there's been peer-reviewed studies showing committee members are linked to big pharma, and there's a financial incentive for them to keep adding more and more disorders that require a sugar-coated pill that you need to require that you need to take every day. So
when we've spoken about psychedelics before on the pods, one of the things that's come through consistently is the fact that you are rewiring, right? You're making connections from parts of your brain that previously hadn't been connected. And we've spoken about how that can be awesome and can shake sticky perceptions, but it also can lead to too much instability, or it can actually tighten up and stratify those connections. How do you consider the role of risk and the role of the individual who's got a brain chemistry unknown to you and unknown to themselves before taking on these things?
So with psilocybin, what they screen for in these studies, that they screen really strictly, which is another whole thing, because when, for example, they screen up to second degree family history of psychosis and schizophrenia, which includes probably a lot of people. So it means that once these new medicines if they get rescheduled and approved, the data is going to look very different once they enter the real world. Anyway, when it comes to the tryptamine psychedelics, I do screen out. I follow the science in some ways, so I do screen out for I don't screen out for second degree. I screen out for first degree, and I validated that with the leadership team of Imperial, and they think that's fine. So first degree uh, uh, history of psychosis, schizophrenia. Because with schizophrenia, I mean, one, we don't in the West, we don't understand psychosis and schizophrenia at all. Really, we medicalize it. In other cultures, if you started hearing voices, that could be a message to become go on a rites of passage to become a leader and a shaman and an elder and we pathologize it in the West, and we try and and it depends on the severity. If it's like paranoid delusional, then it's a complex thing. But so I screen people out. My screening process has been made in development with my friend, PhD researcher at King's University, who kind of leads some of the psychedelic research. And I make sure that they're, I don't work with anybody who's unstable. So I make sure that they're relatively stable. So they're holding down a job, they can work, they have support outside of me. Ideally, they're in regular therapy or having a regular coaching relationship. I don't work with anyone who's desperate. I don't work with anyone who isn't aware that this is a process. It's not a quick fix. It requires effort.
I understand
Yeah.
that stuff on the screening side, but just in terms of the fact that every individual has a unique brain chemistry, and the fact that and I'm just where is that baked into your thinking? So I guess like my experience with psychedelics has been, and I think this is the kind of the thread of the chat we've had here. The benefit of it and the brilliant benefit of it is there are connections that weren't previously made. And it's clearly a bell curve of how much quote unquote instability you want. But of course, everyone has a brain chemistry and no one quite knows how it's going to land. So
Yeah.
I'm sort of asking that, I think, as opposed to necessarily the screening.
Thank you for bringing me back to the connection point. I can be non sequitur. I mean, we don't know basically. I mean, this is where it kind of comes back to, like, we're still understanding things like HPPD, which stands for hallucinogenic persistent something disorder, more and more. The clinical world doesn't understand spiritual experiences well, really, and like spiritual emergencies or spiritual emergencies, Kundalini processes. These things. My ex-girlfriend had a Kundalini awakening activate at a psychedelic experience, had zero holding after, because that's the model. They're just like, oh, you'll be fine, it'll be great. No, it's fucking weird and it's hard. So, yeah. And in terms of connection, yeah, there's like this kind of narrative that isn't true, that these experiences are, it connects, and we become, like hugging hippies afterwards. Like, no, neo-Nazis take psychedelics. Charles Manson took psychedelics. There's nothing like inherently benevolent to these things. Set and setting. It's very much the context in which they're done. So that also needs to be factored. But yeah, in terms of like safety, meditation isn't fully safe, right? Like
Really?
nothing is 100% safe. So that's another thing that I make very clear to my clients that I work with. And I point them into some directions, but I'm like, you've got to do your own research and you've got to feel fully comfortable of what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah.
I want to just talk about the men's therapy for a moment. What is, well, number one, why men's therapy? And two, what is perhaps different about men's therapy than an equivalent mixed gendered cohort?
So it's men's group work. So it's a kind of group work that is targeted for men, and it's a space for men to, historically men haven't had as many opportunities to be vulnerable in community, let's say. It's a need that every human has. Uh, and yeah, so I did it myself. I was asked to facilitate it with a beautiful man called Keith. Then I just got too busy and I couldn't do it anymore. I'm actually about to restart it myself because my therapist is going on a sabbatical, and I need support. So I have peer group support, I have supervision, I have my own therapy. Now that it's going, I still want support. So that's going to be the men's group work. It's a place for men to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be witnessed, and this is where group work is just generally beneficial, I think, because we hold a lot of parts that hold guilt and shame. So in a group setting, there's lots of opportunities to either voice something that your deepest, darkest secret, and see the reaction from the group, which is not maybe your fear, which is like them going, "Oh my God, monster," and running out the room. They're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, me too. Yeah, like totally. Yeah." Or if you don't have that courage, or you're just like a little bit shy, someone else, because it's a group, someone else in the group can name something that you are also experiencing, and you can observe the reaction of the others in the group. So then that becomes corrective. So there's just like, you're kind of like expediting the corrective opportunities to unburden guilt, shame, and be witnessed, and just like explore healthy masculinity. I had a list of useless father figures, in some ways, not all of them. Parts of them were extraordinarily hurtful. Parts of them were lovely, but I didn't grow up with a model of what healthy masculinity looked like. So I sought it out, and that's been really beautiful for me to see that.
The point around you share your darkest, deepest secrets and everyone goes, "Oh, that's fine." It's amazing what making the private public does to your own perception of the shame. Because
Yeah,
in some ways, shame is
so much of keeping things inside just lets them fester. Being able to just expose them and say them out loud to somebody. I mean, no wonder therapy works, because all therapy is an opportunity just to sit with somebody who cares about you and they ask you about what you feel on the inside. Yeah, it's great.
yeah. There's some relationship between shame can only really fester to the degree we think that the subject of the shame is the worst thing ever. And to hear publicly, to have that challenged a touch is sort of unbelievably effective. It says something interesting about the mechanics of shame.
Yeah, and using the IFS model, that part that carries shame needs to be witnessed. CBT will say, just think better thoughts. Just stop. Don't be shameful. Think. Just know that there's nothing to be shameful about. But this part is holding the shame for a reason, and rather than we want to move towards it, and we want to stay with it, and we want to be curious about it. Like, well, tell me, like, why? What's your role? What's your function? And that's for me the best way of removing the shame, is actually really welcoming the parts that have the shame and saying, like, you're welcome. Like, the Rumi thing of like welcoming every part, into the guest house of our being. Sit them down, invite them in for tea, whether it's guilt, shame, fear, lust, whatever it is, and just get really curious about what role are they trying to serve, and what are their needs and what are their fears.
Liam, where can everybody find you online?
My website is brighterpathways.co. So I have my blog there, and the essay that I mentioned is called Trauma Needs A Rebrand. The full title is Trauma Needs A Rebrand, Trauma, Psychedelics, the Limitations of Our Current Models and Exciting Alternatives. I also have an Instagram page, just Liam Farquhar, so LiamFarquhar. Those are the main channels. I have a YouTube channel, but I mean, it just takes so long to. I mean, no, I just there's a couple of videos. That's not the best place. Mostly, and I have a newsletter that when you go on my website, it will invite you to sign up if you want to, and that's where I share most of the stuff, including this is like a summary of all the things that I post.
Brilliant, Liam. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you both. Great questions.
This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. That was Liam Farquhar. Please go check him out and sign up to the newsletter. And as always, we'll be back next week.